Hi everybody, Professor Gassimi here. In this component of our lecture, we are introducing CSS, and specifically we will be speaking about some of the essentials of styling. We're basically introducing CSS, and then in some of the following components of the lecture, we're going to be diving into more detail about specific aspects of CSS and giving you examples for how it operates. As I've mentioned for other components of the lecture, I strongly encourage you to take a look at the associated reading for this to practice some of the concepts and review in greater detail beyond what we cover in the oral part of the lecture. So let's get started, okay? Let's say you have an HTML document like you do on the right-hand side. You might have noticed that if you were to take a document like this, and you should be pretty familiar with a layout like this if you've seen the HTML components of our lecture, you might notice that it's interesting that we don't specify anything about the style of things like the H1 tag, for example, but it just shows up as larger like this, right? You can see the IM level 1 heading is just big by default. Or if I create a hyperlink here, the text turns blue and becomes underlined. Well, that's interesting, right? Because we did also learn that we can include inline style on these tags, and we can alter that. But the reason that this happens is because HTML files have some level of default formatting that's kind of shipped with the HTML. So an H1 is always a certain size, a link is always blue and underlined, and so on and so forth. There's these standard kind of stylistic assumptions that are made when you have an HTML file that govern what it will look like in the visual part of your browser. Now, if you don't want to use those defaults though, if you can think of a better way, for example, to display different kinds of headers, let's say, or a different font for your paragraphs and so on, you might want to start changing the style. And we saw some very simple examples in the previous components of this lecture for how to do that using HTML attributes, right? Well, the problem with including the style in line, of course, is that the styles can get pretty involved, right? There's sometimes multiple elements regarding the background color, regarding the color of the text itself, maybe whether you want to align the text. And so your HTML document can become this giant mess to read. And so typically what you do instead is you come here to the head, okay, and you link a style sheet. So you basically create a document, styles.css, which is going to contain everything that you would have wanted to do if you were just to go into the HTML document style attributes and change it there. Okay, so you define this style sheet, import it in the head, and now within that CSS file, you will be able to make changes to the style. This link tag, by the way, that you see down here, it just informs the web browser that there is a style sheet, because if you recall our last lecture when we were talking about HTTP, the way that a request is made is first an HTML document is fetched, and then remember these links are what are requested next from the web browser back to the main server through a separate HTTP process. Okay, and when you're creating these links, you want to make sure that you specify that it's a style sheet, in addition to giving the particular location of the style sheet on your local machine or on a remote machine. So here's an example of what a style sheet might look like on the right. Let's assume that we had imported it and we had taken care of linking things in the head and so on. Your style sheet might be as simple as, I want my H1 elements, and this, you open the curly bracket to indicate things about the style for this. And then just like we did when we were doing inline styling, where we had a name followed by an attribute and then a semicolon and then another name followed by an attribute, it's the same idea. You list the name attribute pairs that you want to govern this H1 element. And so as an example, if we had this styles.css and we had applied it to our HTML, it would turn what you see on the left-hand side here into what you see on the right-hand side here. That is to say, the H1 or the header which is responsible for I am a level 1 heading, moves from black, which is the default, to red, which is what we specified in our CSS style sheet. Now you can have multiple tags that map onto the same styling, okay? That's one of the nice things, again, about doing this in a style sheet compared to if you had to go in and annotate every last paragraph, every last H1, and every last LI with a style inline element, right? It's rigid, it takes a lot of time, and so on. The way that you can do the mapping to multiple elements to make your style sheets neater is by basically listing the elements that you want to be governed by certain style rules. So in this case, I still have H1 is going to be color red, but then I also have in my style sheet that I want paragraphs and lists, both of them, to be governed by the following rule, which is their color should be purple. And you can see then, coming here to the bottom left, that indeed the header is red and the color of both the list items as well as the paragraph are purple. As I alluded to at the start of this component in our lecture, web browsers do have default styles. H1s are large, list elements have bullets, paragraphs have spacing, so on and so forth, right? But you can use CSS to change those defaults and enhance the formatting. So let's look at some examples. The list element, li, if we updated the CSS to say that list style type was none, we would move from a representation that you see here, item 1, item 2, item 3, with bullet points on the left, to a representation that had no bullet points because we specified that in our style sheet. I should also note that when it comes to styling, you are going to see a universe of possible style attributes. There's a whole lot of them. Some are specific to particular tags, and others are general. Like color, for example, is very general, but list style type is very specific to lists. You don't need to learn every style attribute. I'm going to take you through almost all the style attributes I think that matter for about 80 to 85% of what you will ever need to do for most of your web activities. And then if you need to find additional specific style attributes to be altered for other purposes, hey, that's what the World Wide Web can help you with. Okay, so you can view styling options for lists, actually, because we were speaking about lists, at the web link that I've got there, and they'll give you sort of a whole bunch of potential things you can do other than just the standard default version or removing them altogether. And I think there's some cool options here. So for example, you can set your list style type to a space counter, and then you see you get these little space related emojis that show up, which is pretty cool. You can set them to regular old circles or even thumbs up signs, right? Which I think is pretty neat. So let's speak about properties and values, okay? We already discussed that a CSS declaration is contained within these curly braces. You saw that in some of the previous examples, but formally, just to state it very clearly, for each of the particular elements that you want to attach some style information to, you always open up a curly brace like this and you close a curly brace, and that says that all the properties contained within this curly braces apply to the element outside of and immediately preceding those curly braces, okay? Additionally, you always have a name and a value pair, or oftentimes referred to in CSS lingo, a property and a value pair. Color yellow, background color red, font size 12px, and so on and so forth. I should note that CSS properties, unlike, for example, HTML tags, are case sensitive. Okay, so if a property is unknown, or if a value is not valid for a given property, that declaration is going to be processed as invalid and just ignored by your browser's CSS engine. This can create some interesting challenges when you're trying to debug, because you could look at your CSS style sheet and you could have made a small error like putting too many R's in color or forgetting that you're not supposed to use capitalization, and those style elements just won't render at all. They just won't show up when you come to look at your web page in the browser. So just be cognizant of this when you're working with CSS, that the elements that are not valid will not compile. The elements that are valid will compile. And so if something looks off, you may want to go take a look to make sure there wasn't something incorrect about the way you specified your CSS. So we have some of these basic ideas or conceptions about what CSS does, hopefully in our mind now. Again, it's just all that stuff that we put in the inline style attributes of HTML. We kind of moved it away, right? Clustered it into a style sheet so that it was a little bit more condensed and flexible. That was the idea of having this styles.css. Okay, well, it's really powerful because if we wanted to change, for example, the color here from purple to red, we could do that. Or from purple to green, we could do that without having to do lots of individual changes to individual style elements. One of the things that we can do to make CSS even more powerful is by using something called a class. Okay? And what a class is sort of a unique stylistic definition that we define that we can then run off and apply to elements as needed. So I'm going to show you by way of an example. Let's say we have this HTML snippet on the top right. You can see this is an unordered list, UL, start and end. And it has 3 elements, 3 list elements, 1, 2, 3. You can see that the second of these list elements has an attribute called class. And this class is equal to special. Now, when you set this class here to special, insofar as you have a CSS style sheet linked, what this does is it runs to your CSS and it will look for a element or a entry in your CSS style sheet that begins with a dot, which indicates that it's a class, and then has a token that matches what was put here in your class entity, in this case, special. And what it says is, hey, this list item is class special, so apply these 2 rules. In this case, set the color to orange and set the font weight to bold. And if you were to actually look at those 2 together, you would get something like what you see down here on the bottom left, which is a nice orange bolded item in that list. Now you can apply the class attribute special to any HTML element, not just the list. That's what's nice about doing things in classes, right? Some of those earlier examples, when we were defining things at the level of the list attribute or the paragraph, we were sort of stuck. We couldn't have 2 different kinds of paragraphs with 2 different kinds of style. If we do things in classes, we can now take that class attribute and apply it wherever we think it's interesting. So for example, coming back to this HTML snippet on the top right, we might have a paragraph that precedes that unordered list that we spoke about earlier. We may want to take a portion of that paragraph and, using a span as an example, attach that same class so that we can color a portion of that with the same styling that we had for the item here. And you can see that's precisely what happens if we again turn our attention to the bottom left and look at the resulting display from the browser given the HTML and CSS that's shown on the right. Now, sometimes these styling rules may specify the HTML element as well as the class. Okay, so meaning it may be the case that special in the context of a list item from a class perspective is different than special class when you're talking about a span item. Okay, the way that if you want to make that distinction clear, you do it like I'm showing there on the right. So you'd have li, and then you can see the dot special for the class. Remember, the classes always have the dot in front. Well, what this means is that this particular style rule only works for HTML li elements that have the class special. That's how you read this. So any li elements that are class special will become orange and will have font weight bold. Any span elements in HTML that also have the class special will have a color red and a font weight bold. Okay, you may want content to look different according to the content's location in the document too. Okay, so in the previous example, I said we may want to have two different kinds of definitions of a special class depending on where they're listed. We may also want to have it so that certain kinds of styling only happens under certain hierarchical conditions. So as an example, here on the right-hand side, we may want to set the color of a particular element to be something only when we have an M, or an emphasis, that is hierarchically nested within a list item. And an example of that consequence is sort of shown down here, right? In order to get item 3 here, we would have a list item. Within that list item, we would have an emphasis that would wrap the word 3. And because it's hierarchically organized that way, it's picked up by this style rule that only when I have an emphasis that's nested under a li do I set the color to Rebecca Purple, which then shows up here. Now you can also style an element when it comes directly after another element and is in the same hierarchy level in the HTML. This is distinct from what I showed previously. I want to try to emphasize this distinction. Before, when we had the arrow up here, this just says that if there is an M tag that's nested anywhere under a li tag, anywhere, okay, it could be, there could be a bunch of paragraphs and a bunch of other stuff, and then finally the M shows up somewhere, but the M is fully nested underneath it. Set that M's contents to Rebecca Purple. That's what this one means. That's distinct from using this plus sign here, okay? The plus sign here means only when it directly and immediately follows that element do you want to follow this particular rule. Let me show you an example down here. If we were to have this particular kind of style sheet, what it says is when I have an H1 tag, and this is immediately followed by a P tag, I want the content that is governed in that P tag or described in that P tag to be 200% its font size. So let's come down here to an illustration of what would happen. This stuff here at the level 1 heading is governed by the H1 tag. And if we had a P tag that followed it, the font size of that P is going to explode. If we had another P tag that followed it, well, that doesn't follow this rule anymore. We no longer have an H1 followed by a P. This is a P that was preceded by another P. So it's not governed by that rule, and therefore the font size doesn't change. I'm bringing this up because the key thing that will make CSS a little tricky to get used to is just getting used to reading these portions of your style sheet. What does H1 plus P mean? What does H1 arrow P mean? What does H1 dot special mean? If you can learn to read those and use them appropriately, I would say most of the challenges of reading CSS will be handled. Okay, now a link may appear with different styles to indicate whether it's unvisited, visited, or being hovered on, right? We experience this when we're navigating the web. Like if you usually hover your cursor over a link, sometimes the underline goes away. Or if you click on that link, its color changes to purple, and so on. Well, these are also things that can be edited. But editing these is different than what we've seen so far. Why? Because those have something to do with the state of that element, right? It doesn't have anything to do with, or that is to say, the style depends on the state. Clicked, hovered, or none of the above. And so when you have something that you want to edit from a stylistic perspective that has something to do with the state of the element, that's when you use this colon like you're seeing here on the right-hand side with the style sheet. For example, a colon link means that when I have the unclicked link, I just want its color to be pink. The A colon visited means after someone's clicked the link, I want the color to be green. And the A colon hover says when somebody moves their mouse cursor over this, I want to remove that underline as an example. But you could alter this to be whatever you wanted. Just trying to make the distinction here that if you, for example, came and said that you want the A's color to be pink, that would make all three of these pink, as opposed to just specifying in this particular case with the colon operator that you want it to be dependent on the state of that particular element. There are more complex element orderings that you can specify beyond just the two levels that I've shown you so far. So you could, for example, have some CSS that selects any span that's inside any paragraph, that's inside any article. And in fact, in general, the way I recommend that you read CSS is sort of from right to left, if you will. So again, this line goes and gets any spans that are in any paragraphs, that are in any articles, and it applies the style rule inside the curly braces. Similarly, you could select any paragraph that immediately is preceded by any UL, that's immediately preceded by any H1, and apply a separate kind of styling paradigm. Now, there are functions in CSS, and I actually personally think that using functions in CSS is what makes it tractable, easier, more beautiful and elegant. There are also variables in CSS. A function consists of a function name and some parentheses to enclose the values of the function. So it's a lot like any standard programming languages. So if you look at this example style sheet on the right, what you can see here is I've got two things. I've got a dot outer, okay? And this dot outer says that, because it's a dot, it means that this is a class, right? So any class for which I say it's an outer, I want the border to be 5 pixels, I want that to be solid, and I want it to be a black border. And then after that, I have some information for a class called box. And what I said here is I want the padding around that, that's kind of the white space that's outside of the box, to be 10 pixels in size. And I want this width of this box to be, and this is the important part, calc, this is a function, 90% of the relative area minus 30 pixels. Okay, and I want the background color to be purple, and I want the color to be white. Color here referring to the color of the text. Now, if we look at this particular HTML snippet, what you can see is that's working in combination with the CSS. It's very simple. We just have a class outer. That's again the one that's defined by having this border that's 5 pixels and solid and black. That manifests down here as this black border on the box you're seeing. Within this div of class outer, we have another div, which is class box. This contains the text, which was colored white, as you see here, and shows up here. And the class box says, well, I want to go take whatever 90% of the area is here, and I want to subtract 30 pixels from that and set that equal to the width. So actually, the size of this purple box is a little bit underneath 90%. If you kind of eyeball it too, that makes sense. It's 90% of the total size minus a little bit from the 30 pixels. So you can use this calc function to set things dynamically in your CSS style sheets. There are some other cool properties of CSS that I'm going to mention here in this kind of styling elements lecture, but I won't go into in a lot of detail as we dive deeper later. So I'd just like to mention them here. One of the cool things is actually the transform property, which allows you to rotate your HTML elements. So there's a function actually in CSS called rotate, okay? And you can put in some parameters here to say the rate at which you want this object to rotate, or this picture, or anything else. And there are also some functions that allow you to transform things. So think about instead of grabbing the image and rotating it in the XY plane, you could rotate it in the Z plane as well, okay, or switch it or stretch it and so on. So there's several other operations that allow for those kinds of transforms. Again, because we're doing this overview to start with, I want to make you familiar with these, but these are not things that you will probably be using for most of what we do in the course together. Another thing I want to mention up front about CSS is that it oftentimes will make use of shorthand. And I feel like when people are first getting introduced to CSS, this is one of the places they can trip. So what I mean by shorthand is there's often a longhand way of stating a styling preference. For example, we might want the padding, which is the white space around a block, on the top to be 10 pixels, on the right to be 15 pixels, on the bottom to be 15 pixels, or on the left to be 5 pixels. This in CSS is equivalent to just saying padding : 10 pixel, 15 pixel, 15 pixel, 5 pixel. But if you weren't aware, you may not know that these two are equivalent. Just know that sometimes when you're looking at CSS, there's going to be shorthand. Usually the way to know if it's shorthand is that you're going to have these little white spaces and things are going to look like they're listed. Distinct from when you have semicolons, by the way. Semicolon always indicates that we're done with this particular component of the style definition and we're moving to the next one. Okay, the same thing exists for things that govern the background. You could list the color, the image, the position, whether it repeats, and attachments separately, or you could list them all in one line. One of the important nuances of CSS as well is that there is something called cascading that takes place in CSS, which means that when two rules apply, the last rule in your style sheet is the one that takes precedence. Okay, this is a good thing actually, because it means that if you've written your CSS the correct way, the conflicts could work to the advantage of your styling sheet. But if you're not careful, it can create a lot of confusion. So let's take a look at an example here together. Let's say that we have an HTML snippet that we show here on the left, which is just a H1 tag. This is my heading, and then it's governed by the following style sheet. So here we have H1, color is red, and then we immediately follow it by another H1 rule, color is blue. Well, this is going to be colored blue because you always look at the last entry when there is conflicts between the two. So be aware of this in cases you're doing styling. Something early in your style sheet seems not to be propagating through. It might have something to do with the cascading. Now, styling could be defined to the same HTML element, H1, for example, as well as a class of H1. The browser allows the styling defined in the class to take precedence over the tag/selector. So let me be very clear. If we spoke about cascading before, right? And we said, hey, if we had two H1s here, then we were always going to take the bottom one, the one that showed up last. But there's some notion of specificity taking precedence in HTML, meaning that an H1 tag is really general, right? It's the most general thing because it governs an HTML element. A class is more specific than a tag is. And so if CSS hits a conflict between a class level style and a tag level style, it's always going to choose the more specific one. In this case, this H1 tag has a class main heading, which means it's governed by this rule, color red. But because it's an H1, it's also governed by this rule, color blue. And because classes are more specific than elements, it's going to choose color red, again, because of the specificity. Another thing that's important to keep in mind when you're working with CSS is inheritance. So some CSS property values set on parent elements are inherited by their children elements, and some aren't. For example, if you set a color or font family on an element, every element inside of it is going to have those styles as well, unless you've applied a different value directly to it. So let's look at an example again. Here we have our style sheet. We have body. We want the color to be blue. And then we have a span inside where we want the color to be black. Now, notice that here, this content, by the way, is all wrapped within a body. That's normal. Remember, we spoke about that earlier. What happens is, even though we've not formally said that we want paragraphs to be blue in color, notice that they are blue nevertheless, because, again, there's inheritance. The P is contained within the body, and therefore the P says, well, my parent's color is blue, and therefore I'm going to change my color to blue. And in the case of the span, it is not blue only because we specified it here in the color, in the style sheet, that the color should be black. So be aware of this inheritance property as well. It might help save you some time when you're debugging your CSS. Fortunately, there is a way to control inheritance in CSS. There are 4 special universal property values for controlling inheritance, which I'd like to take you through. The inherit value sets the property applied to a selected element to be the same as that of its parent. So you say, it's effectively saying, turn on the inheritance. There is a initial property that sets it to whatever the initial value of that property was. So sort of the default, if you will. Initial is kind of like default. Unset resets the property to its natural value. So that basically means if you hadn't put any rules on me and I was a paragraph, I'm going to inherit, and otherwise I'm going to act like my initial state. Okay, and the last one is revert, which acts like the unset does, but it will revert to the browser's default settings rather than defaults that you applied to that property. Okay, so I think the main thing to know here is that inheritance is actually your friend. You shouldn't fear this element of inheritance that exists in CSS. It's a good thing, but just know that you can, in certain circumstances, if needed, turn it off. That's the reason I'm bringing this up. So let's take a look at how to control inheritance by example. Let's say that we had some HTML here. So you can see this is a unordered list, or a UL. Here's the top and here's the encasing. And then we have 4 list elements. And you might notice that the first list element contains a link, right? An A tag. And then we have the remaining 3 list elements, each governed by a class. Okay. One of the classes is my class 1, followed by my class 2, followed by my class 3, and so on. Each of these also contain a link within them. So now let's go look at our CSS style sheet here on the right-hand side. And what we notice is that the color of the body was set to green. And remember, the body is what contains everything here, including this unstructured list. Everything's always contained that you see from a content perspective in the body. Okay, and so because of inheritance, what are you expecting? Well, the text color is going to be sort of green on all the paragraphs and all the leaves and everything else by default, because they're going to inherit that from the body. Now, what we've done here, though, is notice that for the 3 classes, my class 1, my class 2, and my class 3, that govern these 3 list items respectively, we have set different inheritance rules. For example, on the second item here, my class 1, we've set the color to be inherit. And so what this does is it explicitly tells it to set the color on this according to the parent. In this case, it's the UL, which gets it from the body. And so the link color becomes green instead of blue. In the case of my class 2, which governs this link down here in black, the link color inherits black, which is the default value, and not the browser's default value of blue. Okay, that want to make the subtle distinction here. There's a difference between the default value of the actual element versus the default value of your browser. That's the reason why, actually, even with very simple HTML documents, the ways that hyperlinks might look or headings might look could be slightly different depending on whether you're using Firefox or Chrome or something else. Okay. And lastly, if you look at this example 4 here, if you set the color to unset, so you want an unset inheritance property, the link color defaults to the style of the body. Okay, so hopefully this gives you a little bit of idea about inheritance. It's not critical, I think, for most of what you're going to want to do. I think the main thing to take away from this is knowing that inheritance A exists and that B, it can be altered if needed. Okay, last item I want to touch on as we get to the end of this component of our lecture is about formatting your CSS. Some developers put all the rules onto a single line, like I'm showing there on the left, and others prefer to break everything onto a new line, like I'm showing in the right. So these are called single line format and multi-line format. I personally, unless the rule is very short, prefer a multi-line format. I just think it makes it easier to read. There isn't an absolute truth or set of standards for how to do this, but you need to be consistent. So I encourage you not to use both single line and multi-line format. Choose one format and stick to it. CSS can also, especially as you get into more complex styling operations, can become a little unintuitive because of all the things we mentioned, the specificity, the inheritance, and so on. And so it's oftentimes useful as your CSS projects get larger and a little bit more complicated to make good use of comments in the files, okay? A good tip is to add a block of comments between logical sections in the style sheet to help locate different sections quickly when you're scanning it, all right? These are examples of how you do a multi-line comment and comments as sections. It's also a good idea to have all of the common styling first in the style sheet. This means that all of the styles which will generally apply, unless you do something special with that element, should come first. So, meaning that you present the rules in sort of the inverse order of their specificity, meaning that, body is going to have a lot of things that inherit from it, right? There's going to be a ton of things that when you set the style here, a bunch of stuff downstream is going to inherit. So the first thing you'd want a person coming and reading your style sheet to know is, well, how did you set up the body? And then you're probably going to have a whole lot of paragraph content inside of your HTML document because it's a document after all, right? And so the next thing you'd want to show in your style sheet is the paragraph styling, followed by headings, which are probably going to be next, followed by unstructured and ordered lists, followed by tables and links and so on. In the first section of the style sheet, you should provide default styling for the body, the headings, the list, the tables, etc., exactly as I mentioned. But after this first section that dictates the general styles, okay, for the particular elements, if you choose to put styles on those, you should have a separate section that talks about the styles for your classes as an example, or some of the more complex hierarchical components, okay? So notice that all of these general styling rules in the top block govern elements in general, whereas the things that have to do with classes, because they're more specific, will supersede these rules when the class is applied and should be therefore put underneath. I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but just wanted to formally state here that you can declare variables in CSS. They're usually useful for, as an example, defining a color, okay? And these colors then you could go, if you have a bunch of places in CSS that you want to be uniformly colored, instead of writing it out 50 times, you change it in one place and it propagates throughout your document, okay? There's a really clear advantage to doing it that way. If you create a variable called, for example, main bg color with a :root pseudo class, this is called a pseudo class, you could use it throughout the style sheet anywhere that required that color using the variable function, as you see here on the right-hand side. So this is again how you declare a variable in CSS, what I'm showing on the left. And this is an example of where somewhere in your style sheet downstream, you would apply that variable by calling it using var.